This really happened to me, and I've never told it this plainly before. I'm 61 now, and the night it started I was standing in a brand new Seaport condo with a used brass telescope pointed straight across Fort Point Channel. He had betrayed me, and I had the telescope to prove it. In the glass box of his office at 368 Congress Street, you could see everything: Friday happy hour under the Edison bulbs, bottles of Whistlepig lined like trophies, the same smug laugh I'd memorized across 32 years. His firm, Beacon Ridge Strategies, was celebrating a record quarter, while the papers he used to strip my life sat in a banker's red folder on his desk. I'd been invited to that office once, for our 25th anniversary dinner at Legal Seafoods downstairs. Everyone was gathered to toast the woman behind the man. That night, the gathering was for something else. I could see Dan motion to the conference table, and when his assistant saw the ring box, she covered her mouth with a hand I recognized from my kitchen because she had served me cake on my birthday a year earlier. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The condo didn't feel like mine yet. The hardwood still smelled like finish. The cardboard wardrobe boxes leaned on each other like tired people. I hadn't hung a single picture, just the telescope, polished by a stranger's hands in a Cambridge antiques shop, now staking a claim to my new life. It aimed across the water the way a pointer dog locks onto a bird. Dan's office lights glowed against the evening fog rolling off the harbor. He'd moved Beacon Ridge to Fort Point because the glass made him feel clean, he said, and clients liked sunlight on their promises. I knew better. Glass was a mirror to a man like him. He wanted to see himself reflected from every angle. Boston had always belonged to him in his mind. As a young associate at a consulting firm on State Street, he drank martinis at Marleyave and said, "Someday, Evie, I'll have a corner office people can see from a bridge." He had it now. And the bridge they could see from was mine. They told me I couldn't live without him. My neighbors in our old Somerville triple-decker, the couples from St. Anthony's where we sat in pew 7, even our daughter's kindergarten teacher back then when Lucy was 5 and brought home finger-painted portraits of Mommy and Daddy, all of them said it without saying it. Dan shook hands with judges at charity galas at the Omni Parker House and charmed waiters by remembering how they took their coffee. "You two are a team," people would chirp, like we were a brand. Behind doors, he catalogued my faults until I folded like a shirt: too cautious about money, too attached to the old Subaru, too sentimental about my late mother's needlepoint. "I'm the rainmaker," he'd say. "You do the weather." Meaning, I set the climate, you adapt. He adapted my money, too. I discovered that 4 months after he left, when a Santander loan officer on State Street called about a missed payment on a HELOC I didn't know existed. "But you signed, Mrs. Daly," she said. Power of attorney. The signature looked like mine. The flourish on the Y in Evelyn was dead on, the lean of the letters identical. It was so close to real I doubted myself. Maybe I had signed, in one of those nights when he pressed papers on the dining table, kissed my hair, and said, "You trust me, don't you?" When he filed for divorce, he insisted on clean and quick, and our lawyer, who had coached the two of us on estate planning for 15 years, called it the dignified road. Dan kept the summer place in Truro, for continuity, the new BMW, and Beacon Ridge, of course. I kept stability, the Somerville house and a pension that looked healthy until the HELOC ballooned like a bruise. The court decree was neutral. The math was not. I sold the house. Tried a cheap one-bedroom on Revere Beach where the salt wind cut through the cheap windows and my memories grew damp. One night, eating chowder from a paper cup and staring at the neon Kelly's roast beef sign, I realized I hated being far from the city that taught me to read people's faces on the Green Line and count the steps to the 4th floor at Suffolk County Superior. Boston wasn't his, it was ours. I took the measly profit from the sale, cashed an IRA earlier than I should have, and bought the smallest, highest, most defiant two-bedroom I could find in the Seaport with one requirement, a northeast corner view that punched straight into Dan's glass hive. From that height, nights stretched. You learn the tempo of a building when you watch it, who stays late, who cleans up the cups, who steals the nicer pens. I made tea at 11 and another at 2. I kept a late widow's watch for a man who wasn't dead yet. The week after the ring box, a FedEx courier came at 7:13 p.m. to Beacon Ridge. I saw Dan sign. The courier lifted a red folder out of his bag and arranged it like a substitute for conscience right in the center of the conference table. The next morning, through my scope, I watched Dan open it, leaf through signatures, and slip the folder into a drawer he locked with childish ceremony. When he left for a client lunch at Yvonne's on Winter Place, a woman with a copper bob, the new assistant, lifted the red folder and copied numbers from it onto a yellow legal pad. She checked her phone. The numbers rolled her eyes before they rolled her pen. I am an older woman, but you develop new muscles when you've lost. After decades as a court reporter, my fingers still know a stenographer's speed, and my mind knows how to build a timeline so tight it squeaks. I started a notebook, black moleskine, squared pages. I drew windows and labeled them like a crime scene. I wrote down times, lights on, lights off, assistant in red coat leaves with tote patterned in blue fans, courier returns with signature required. I learned which desks belonged to the partners by the way they draped their suit jackets. I taped a small map of Fort Point to my wall. I marked the routes to the Moakley Courthouse and to City Hall where the BPDA held hearings about development projects. Beacon Ridge advised. People think revenge is heat. Mine began as quiet inventory. I looked at the glass and wrote down who believed they were untouchable. The first real clue broke me open like a geode. I took the Green Line to Government Center, cut across the brick plaza, and climbed the long flights to the Registry of Deeds because paper is where men like Dan forget people like me can read. In the dull hum of fluorescent lights, I asked a clerk to pull the original Hellick documents. When I held the copy on the gray counter, I felt my cheeks burn. My signature was there. But the notary's stamp? The date? It was our 20th anniversary. We were in Provincetown that entire week. In my notebook, I had a receipt from the Lobster Pot and a photo printed on glossy paper of Dan holding a paper-hatted birthday cake because the waiters always thought we were one of those couples who celebrated everything. I took my photos and the Hellick papers to a coffee shop on Cambridge Street. I lined them up. I put on reading glasses and took them off, put them on again, because the truth often requires more magnification than your pride. The notary stamp belonged to someone named R. M. Carver. I ran my finger over the raised ink. I Googled R. M. Carver, Massachusetts notary, and found a LinkedIn for a woman who had once worked as a paralegal at a firm that did outside contracts for Beacon Ridge. The coincidence closed like a jaw. I was not powerless. I was patient. That night, I wrote Carver in block letters. I added BPDA to my board. I circled red folder. And I drew a box around North Ferry Development, a name I'd heard uttered over and over in muffled conference calls that drifted through Dan's speakerphone whenever he forgot the glass leaked sound when the windows were cracked for air. Before I slept, I turned my telescope back to Beacon Ridge. Dan was alone, jacket off, feet on the credenza like a teenager, flipping a silver dollar across his knuckles. He'd done that in our kitchen when Lucy was 6 and thought magic was something her father kept in a pocket. He dropped the coin, winced, and bent to pick it up. When he stood, he stared out across the water. I felt the ridiculous shiver of being seen, even though he couldn't see me. Maybe he felt something. Maybe the wind shifted. Maybe the line between past and present built a bridge, and he paused at the midpoint without knowing why. He lifted a bottle, took a long drink, and raised it toward the window the way men salute the mirror without admitting they love themselves. Then he set it down and reached for the red folder. I didn't know it then, but in less than a week that folder would make him send a letter to my door that began, "Cease and desist," and end with a threat to take the only thing I had left. I fell asleep hand on the telescope, the cold brass like a vow against my cheek, and woke to the red dawn that comes before the city decides who belongs here and who gets pushed to the water's edge. The day the letter came, I had just returned from the South Boston post office with a roll of forever stamps and a burst of purpose so bright it felt like youth. I had filed a preliminary complaint with the Attorney General's office, Consumer Protection, Financial Fraud. I had called the state's Public Records Division to request emails between BPDA staff and any accounts ending with at beaconridge.com or at northferrydev.com for the period covering 2 crucial months. I knew North Ferry Development was poised for a land disposition vote that would pivot on ethics. I knew Beacon Ridge was being paid an advisory retainer that smelled like a bribe parted out and laundered as community engagement. I didn't know yet whether Dan's fingerprints were on it or someone else's. But I knew what dirty retainer work looked like. I'd transcribed hearings long enough to see how hope got monetized. The letter was heavy with lawyer confidence, a square envelope like a white brick. You are hereby instructed to cease and desist from any further malicious defamation, stalking behavior, and unlawful surveillance of Beacon Ridge Strategies, its officers, or its clients. It claimed I had spied on confidential materials from an illegally obtained vantage. It alleged I had harassed Dan by appearing at restaurants and places of business in proximity to Mr. Daly. It demanded $200,000 in damages if I didn't comply. And it was signed by a firm Dan had bragged he could make dance with a single call. I sat at my kitchen island, quartz swirled like weather, and laid the letter flat. The word that throbbed wasn't malicious. It was illegally obtained vantage. I owned my vantage. I bought it with the money he tried to leech. I had receipts. I called the number on the letter. My vantage, I said when a junior associate with a rinsed voice answered, is a window. Silence, then professional condescension. Ma'am, any further contact should be through counsel. Counsel is me, I said. You can put Pro SE on the folder. I printed the letter, highlighted the threats, and put it in a clear binder. Then I took the binder to the Moakley courthouse, through the metal detectors where the guards pretend everyone is equal for a second because we all take off our belts. I asked the clerk about filing an anti-slap motion. He nodded like we were in on a secret. We see a lot of those now, he said. Folks trying to silence people before a vote. He handed me a stapled packet with the words, Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation, at the top. I read it in the cafeteria overlooking the harbor and felt something hard click into place inside me, a gear, old and reliable. That evening, through the telescope, I watched a meeting at Beacon Ridge slide into focus. The partners sat with their serious faces on. The copper-bobbed assistant poured sparkling water into tumblers. The red folder was back on the table. A man I didn't recognize, square jaw, expensive haircut, set a knuckle on the folder like he meant to drive it through. I took pictures with my phone through the eyepiece, awkward, flawed, proof anyway. The timestamp captured the time. The photos captured the folder open, the yellow legal pad with numbers, the faces. I knew none of that was the kind of evidence that would win a case. But evidence doesn't begin as a slam dunk. Evidence begins as the moment you stop letting a man tell you what your eyes already know. At 9:22 p.m., my phone chimed. A message slid into my anonymous Gmail I used for public records requests. Subject line, North Ferry, start here. The sender was harbor_ghostat, and the body was bare except for a link to a spreadsheet on a file-sharing site. I almost didn't click. Then I did. Tabs opened with dates and amounts, the kind of careful lying that looks like accounting. Beacon Ridge Retainer. Community Engagement Subvendor. Neighborhood Advisory Stipend. Same amounts, cut in thirds, moving in a circle like a shell game. One tab had a column called RFQ Influence. I sat back so fast my chair skittered. I took a breath and leaned in. In the far right column, a set of initials, RMC. Carver. The notary. I set my tea down and watched my hand shake. I knew what I had. A knot of money. A whisper of a hand. A path. I also knew the email could be bait. If Dan suspected I was watching, he'd bait the hook with my history of belief. He knew I wanted to prove him. He knew I wanted a clean story where he was the villain and I was the careful woman who saw well at last. The careful woman steadied her hands, saved the files, and looked back out the window. Across the water, Dan stood with his back to me, his head bowed, arms out as if explaining his innocence to the room. The copper-bobbed assistant stared at the red folder like it was a fire she'd lit by accident. The square-jaw man wore a smile that lawyers save for situations where one more signature makes the future pay. And then Dan turned and looked up at the black glass and the dark beyond it where he couldn't see me. He didn't wave. He didn't salute. He just lifted his chin like he was testing how hard the air had grown and whether it would bend to his will as usual. I lifted the binder with his threat letter, set it next to my telescope, and said out loud to the empty room, "You made this vantage." I slept in a chair next to the window. It felt like keeping watch over the version of myself that people believed had died when he walked out. In the morning, I put on my mother's old navy blazer, rode the elevator down with two tech workers carrying scooters, and walked across the channel to Fort Point. The day felt like the inside of a pearl, wet, luminous, treacherous. On a street I passed Trillium, where Dan liked to drink foggy IPAs and tell out-of-town clients that Boston proved its grit in winter. He had wintered through nothing. I ducked into a copy shop and made 3 redacted packets of the spreadsheet, one for the Attorney General, one for state ethics, one for a reporter at the Bay State Ledger, a regional business paper I'd copied court dockets for in another life when I was still learning the smell of ink. I typed short cover letters. No adjectives. No accusations. Dates. Amounts. Names. At noon, I took the Silver Line to South Station, cut up Summer Street, and walked into Yvonne's where Dan held court. I didn't have to go in. But sometimes the only way to train your fear is to walk it on a leash through the room where it lives. The hostess looked me up and down and asked if I had a reservation. "I'll just be a minute," I said. When she hesitated, the bartender, a man with a handlebar mustache who'd served me once on a birthday I'd celebrated alone, said, "She's fine." Dan was at the back, under the velvet painting of a foreign palace he loved because it felt imperial and ironic. He was younger than his years across the room, expensive tan, teeth bleached like surrender flags. The copper-bobbed assistant sat to his right, laughing at a sentence he hadn't finished because that was the job. On the banquette opposite him, a city contractor I recognized from a BPDA meeting leaned in over the table like his appetite was a magnet. The red folder lay between them, like a shame folded to size. He saw me. The way his face rearranged itself, polite shock, then dismissal, then interest, was a choreography I knew by heart. He lifted a hand. I didn't go over. I stood at the bar, ordered a club soda, and waited until he rose to visit the bathroom because vanity makes you vulnerable. As he passed the bar, he murmured, "We're sending a complaint to the court if you continue this, Evie." I took my club soda and smiled. I filed anti-slap at Moakley this morning. He blinked, then recovered with a smirk so gentle you could mistake it for love. "That's cute," he said. "You always did like words in all caps." "I like them when they protect speech," I said. "You should try it." He leaned closer, so close I could count the citrus in his cologne. "Listen," he said, like he was lowering a drawbridge to let mercy through. "I'm going to pretend you're not spinning around up there alone making a fool of yourself. Sell the condo. Take the proceeds, move someplace warm, and stop embarrassing Lucy. I'll make the Hellick disappear." "The Hellick," I said softly, "was notarized by your notary on a day I was in Provincetown with you." His jaw did the thing it did when he'd been caught in a lie too small to matter. "Memory's tricky," he said. "You always kept receipts," I said. "I still do." When he went back to his table, he let his palm brush my wrist in a gesture calibrated to look like pity. That was the moment I stopped wanting to win and started wanting to end the man who used the vocabulary of kindness to rebrand cruelty. Back at my condo, I lined up the copies and the packets and the anti-slap paperwork. The telescope winked in the late sun like a conspirator. At 6, the BPDA posted the agenda for the North Ferry vote, Thursday, 3 p.m., 1 City Hall Square. I pressed my thumb into the paper until the whirl left a mark. On Thursday at 3 p.m., I sat 3 rows back and watched the men of North Ferry talk about jobs and light and setbacks and the word vibrant until it lost meaning. Beacon Ridge's partner, Dan, stepped to the podium to describe community benefits. He gestured to a slide with a stock photo of smiling kids under a mural, and for a fraction of a beat I thought of the afternoons he used to coach Lucy's softball team, the way he would lay his hand on the kids' shoulders to steady their swing. Then his voice wheeled into performance. I stood and walked down the aisle with my packet like I was going to communion. "Public comment," the chair said. I gave my name. I said I lived in the Seaport. I said I had concerns about advisory retainers and the distribution of funds to organizations that didn't seem to exist. I said I had filed a complaint with the Attorney General. I placed the packet on the table. My hands didn't shake. I didn't accuse him by name. I said dates. I said amounts. I said, R.M. Carver. And I sat. Dan turned a shade one notch off his tan, the color of a man who bites down on tin foil. He looked out into the audience and didn't see me for a second because I was not his story anymore. I was a woman in a navy blazer with a voice like law. The chair thanked me in the tone people use when they hope something goes away by being polite to it. The vote was postponed. Pending review. When we walked out into the bright burn of City Hall Plaza, Dan was waiting. "You're done," he said. "You wanted a war," I said. "You're getting a ledger." He sent another letter that night, this one angrier and sloppy. I added it to the binder. I emailed the ledger reporter and asked if she wanted to see a puzzle put together. She did. We met at Flower in Fort Point at a window table where I could keep an eye on Beacon Ridge. She was younger than Lucy and wore an expression like a scanner. I laid out the maps and the timeline and the packets. "I can't print until the AG confirms," she said. "Then ask for comment," I told her. "See if they call your editor." They did. And while they tried to lean on the paper, the Attorney General called me. A woman with a voice like a well that had been dug carefully. "Miss Daly," she said. We've received additional materials corroborating yours. We would like you to come in, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., 1 Ashburton Place. That night, I sat in the dark with the telescope and watched Beacon Ridge keep its lights on too late. The cleaners came and went. The partners left with their shirts damp in the back. At midnight, the square-jaw lawyer came alone, unlocked the conference room, and carried the red folder out like he was smuggling a heart. He went to the elevator and disappeared. I took a photo anyway. Evidence begins as light hitting glass. At 9:30 the next morning, I walked past the State House and into the AG's office. The carpet was the exact color of calm. They put me in a conference room with a carafe of water and a bowl of peppermints. Two women came in, one with a legal pad already thick with notes. The older one, older like me, said, "I'm not asking you to be brave. You already are. I'm asking you to be precise." I told them so much precision the air got heavy with it. When I was done, the younger woman asked if I would be willing to sign an affidavit. My hands, the ones Dan used to call bird bones, did not shake. I signed my name without the flourish because I wanted it plain. By Monday, Beacon Ridge's name had disappeared from the BPDA agenda for two other projects. The ledger ran a small item, AG reviewing advisory payments tied to North Ferry development. It was the kind of piece that makes men in suits look up over their coffee. Dan called. "What do you want?" he asked, and for the first time, he sounded like a man hearing that the tide had turned without asking his permission. "I want my name off anything you forged," I said. "I want you to say Lucy's mother isn't crazy. I want the money you drained from the house returned. I want you to stop telling people I can't live without you." He laughed, because laughing was cheaper than remorse. "You're not getting a dime," he said. "Then I'll take the view," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He was used to seeing and not seeing simultaneously. It was his talent and his curse. 2 weeks later, we were in Suffolk Superior for a motion on the anti-slap. The courtroom smelled like varnish and old paper. The judge was a woman with hair the color of iron. Dan sat at counsel table in a suit that tried hard. His lawyer argued about a jilted spouse weaponizing public records to torment a legitimate business. My turn came last. I told the judge I had bought a condo with a view of an office and seen numbers that didn't add. I told her I'd filed proper complaints. I said I wanted to speak without some man stepping on my mouth with a shoe disguised as a letter. The judge looked at Dan the way women look at men who have never been told no by someone with power. Then she turned to me. "Miss Daly," she said, and the formality softened into a person. "Your speech is protected." She granted the motion. She ordered Beacon Ridge to pay my fees. She suggested a forensic review of the notarization on the Hellick documents. The clerk banged the gavel with a satisfaction I wanted to bake into a cake. Beacon Ridge appealed. Of course they did. Men like Dan use time as a weapon. But something had shifted. Clients began to ask for clarity and distance. That's how power bleeds out, not with a puncture, but in a slow leak through words that sound polite. The square-jaw lawyer went gray around the temples in a week. The copper-bobbed assistant stopped laughing at sentences he hadn't finished. I watched the office empty earlier and earlier. At night, Dan stood in the conference room alone with the lights off, looking out at the water. I didn't pity him. Pity is a luxury I gave up when I sold my house. I watched because I wanted to witness the moment a man sees the horizon for what it is, a line that doesn't move when you command it. The forensic examiner confirmed what I knew about the Hellick. The notary's log was irregular. The bank asked me to come in to resolve anomalies. Translation: Dan had salted the ground and now the bank wanted a truce before the Attorney General's office asked them why there were footprints across a document. I brought my binder. The branch manager brought a man from Risk. In the end, the bank voided the HELOC, refunded fees, and sent me a letter with the word error in it, which was the closest thing to an apology banks ever give. The day the refund hit my account, I walked into the lobby of my building and bought a real couch. I told the salesperson in the South End I wanted one you could fall into and not feel like you had to hold yourself together to sit. They called it Cloud. I called it a place to land. They delivered it the next morning, and I watched the delivery guys look out at the view the way I looked out at it the first night, like everything sharp had been sanded by a light hand. Dan called again. "You made your point," he said. "Let it go." He was wearing his gentle voice, the one he kept for boardrooms and children. "I'm not holding it," I said. "I'm setting it down where it belongs." He came to Trillium the next night. I had expected him to summon me to his office, where he could gesture heavenward at his logo and make me feel poor. Meeting on my ground threw him. He chose a high top. I chose a stool where the draft from the door would hit him more than me. "You win," he said. "That was quick," I said. "Very un-Dan." He pressed his tongue to his molar in thought. "I'll say Lucy's mother isn't crazy," he said. "I'll correct anything false. You, in return, stop painting me as a criminal." "I've never called you that," I said. "I've only said numbers out loud." He laughed through his nose. "You always were the court reporter even when nobody asked for the transcript." "People have started asking," I said. "The Ledger." "The AG." "A city councilor who would love to run on cleaning up advisory fees." He blanched. "They have nothing on me," he said, and he almost believed it. "They have your name next to Carver's initials," I said. "And a timeline. And a view." "Jesus, the view," he snapped. "What is this? You sit up there with a spyglass like some harbor witch taking notes on me peeing at midnight?" I didn't flinch. "No," I said. "I sit up there like a woman who sold her house because a man thought she wouldn't notice he was spending it. I sit up there like someone who learned about horizons. I sit up there because you wanted glass." He stared at me like he was trying to push me back into the shape he'd carved when we were 25 and newly married in a Cambridge apartment with a radiator that screamed. I did him the dignity of not shrinking. He picked at the label of his beer. "What do you want?" he asked again, but softer. "I want you to look out your office window tonight," I said. "When you do, I want you to understand that the woman you wanted to be invisible bought the sky over your head." He paid in cash, a flourish like a last magic trick. He did not touch me when we left. I walked the long way home down Melcher, listening to my shoes count the blocks. At the lobby, the doorman nodded as if he knew the script of a small victory. Upstairs, I set the telescope precisely, the way you calibrate an instrument for true north. At dawn a week later, the Ledger published the long piece. It was careful, fair, and devastating. The AG announced a formal probe into advisory retainers associated with development proposals submitted to this office. The BPDA rewrote part of its ethics policy in a bland paragraph that saved the city face and shaved Dan's leverage off at the root. 2 clients terminated their contracts with Beacon Ridge in letters that used the words, reputation risk. Then the landlord of 368 Congress filed notice for lease violation, something to do with late payments. The glass box was still glass, but the light inside it had the sickly color of a story ending. I watched movers carry bankers' boxes out on a Friday night so no one would see the walk of shame. The copper-bobbed assistant tried to cover the company logo with a brown throw blanket, as if that would stop time from seeing them. Dan came last. He stood at the conference table with his hands flat as though pressing down on the recent past to keep it from lifting up and flying away. I wrote Lucy a letter I never sent. She knew pieces. She was 30 now, living in Austin, and had learned to translate her father's charm into a language the men she dated couldn't weaponize against her. I told her I had been brave and then careful and then brave again. I told her I had listened to the sound of the city and learned it had always been speaking to me. I told her the telescope had taught me distance, how to see without being pulled into the gravity of a man who thinks he is the center. One more thing needed doing. Not for the AG or the paper or the nice woman at the registry who had passed me an extra copy because she said, "Men like that forget we have eyes." It was for me. I wrote Dan a final email with a subject line, receipt. In it, I listed what he had taken and what he had tried to take. I listed what I had recovered and what I had discovered. I kept it plain. I ended with, "They told me I couldn't live without you. I bought a condo overlooking your office and learned to breathe." That night I turned on my living room lamp and aimed it not at the telescope but at the window, so a square of warm gold floated on the black water. Across the channel, Dan stood in the empty shell of Beacon Ridge, no pictures, no clients, no red folder. He looked out at the square of light. He knew. The way his shoulders dropped said he understood that this was the view he had purchased for me with all his lies, a clean line from my forgiveness to his end. I didn't wave. I didn't raise a glass. I stood in my own light for a count of 10, then turned it off, letting the room go back to darkness where I could see better. The condo has settled around me now. The cloud couch has learned the shape of my naps. The telescope sits like a brass pet, ornamental, no longer a weapon. The city keeps doing what cities do, forgetting yesterday to make room for tomorrow. Sometimes I walk to the Moakley courthouse and sit on the bench that faces the water. I watch the kids climb on the sculpture and the lawyers hurry with their files like they're carrying delicate pastries. I think about how many women will have to buy their own windows to see clearly. I hope fewer. I hope more see in time without the brass. People ask if I regret the condo. The money. The long nights. The way revenge took up a room in my life. I tell them revenge isn't a room, it's a corridor. You walk down it to a door that only you can open. On the other side is a small, clean kitchen with a kettle and a window and a table where you can lay out papers and make sense. On the other side is a view. Sometimes, in winter, the harbor freezes into a skin that cracks like old paint. The wind makes the window sing. I make tea, let the steam fog the glass, and draw hard in the condensation because I still can. It's for my mother, who never saw me this strong. It's for my daughter, who will. It's for the girl I used to be, who thought love was enduring storms made by men who loved the sound of thunder. Once, I ran into R.M. Carver at a bakery in the North End. She was older, like me, and carrying a box of cannoli and an expression that had learned to come home before dark. She saw me, and the blood left her face like a tide turning. "You don't have to," I said gently. "You already did." She nodded, once, a benediction for both of us, and left without her change. I took the dollar the cashier waved and set it in the tip jar. None of us leave clean. Some of us leave better. Beacon Ridge is a co-working space now, full of kids in hoodies who can't imagine the smell of old paper or a threat delivered by letter. They ride scooters in the hall after hours and leave neon sticky notes like confetti. Sometimes I see a couple kissing in the glass at night, their reflections doubling like a trick. I wish them a good ledger, tender in, tender out. I don't tell this story to the women in my building who chat about rates and restaurants in the elevator. They know something of it anyway. They see it in the way I hold the door, like a person who learned that doors aren't always open for you. I tell it here because people told me I wasn't survivable, and I want the stranger listening at midnight, maybe you, to know that you are more survivable than anyone's theory. On those nights when the fog swallows the skyline and the bridge lights float like beads on a hidden string, I walk to the window and stare at the water until my breath slows. Across the channel, a janitor vacuums the carpet of the old office, and it looks like erasing. Somewhere, a courier carries a red folder to a different desk under a different sign. The city keeps its own books. It always balances them, eventually, at a scale too grand for one man to rig. I turn the telescope gently toward the horizon, not because I need it, but because it feels right to aim something polished at the future as if to honor its shape. If you stood in my living room, you'd see a reflection of a woman at peace, softened by a lamp, framed by glass she paid for, holding a cup that doesn't shake. And if you looked closer, you'd notice the haunting thing. The office across the way is dark now, but I can still trace, in the memory of its light, the outlines of a man who believed he couldn't be seen. The night preserves him only long enough to remind me of the simple truth I earned the hard way. I bought the view not to watch him fall, but to watch myself rise, and keep rising long after he stopped looking up. The end.